Impact of poverty on child development, education implications. Unfortunately, as you probably all know, there is quite a lot of implications and the impact of poverty on child development and education are quite huge. That's why I said we're coming now to a very grave part of the presentation. A lot of this data is rather actually quite sad, and unfortunately it proves that the slogan education means equity is not quite true. I will go first a little bit to the conclusions of the regional GEM report that we've been working on in the network for the last year. Just came out. It covers our region as well as the region of Central Asia and Caucasus and Eastern Europe. But one of its main conclusions is that low rates of entry, progression, and learning are just the final and probably the most visible outcome of socioeconomic process that marginalizes, disappoints, and aliens children and youth. That the toxic mix of poverty and discrimination results in them being excluded because of who they are. Powerful social, political, and economic mechanisms related to the distribution and use of opportunities, especially early in life, have major lasting effects on inclusion in education. And here they point out and even bold it that poverty is the most important one. Just these sentences, I think, already set us in a situation where we know that the situation is not good. And I'll give you some more details on data a little bit later. What is even more frightening in a way is that we know that post-COVID-19 economic fallout will increase this adversity. According to the World Bank, poverty rates are expected to rise by 6 percentage points in two of the countries which are part of our project, Albania and North Macedonia. And we also know that children are more vulnerable to poverty to start with. For example, in Romania and Turkey, they're over 1.5 times more likely to be poor than adults. And if we move then to just basic data from our countries, you will see, oh, why now not going anywhere? So poverty data in our countries. In Albania, absolute poverty child rate is at 20%. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, child poverty rate is at 31%. In Kosovo, 48.6% of the children live in poverty and 18.9% in absolute poverty. In North Macedonia, the child poverty rate is 27.8%. In Serbia, the absolute poverty child rate is 7.8%, much lower than what we see in other countries, but we know that the children at risk of poverty, this number increases to much higher. And then for Turkey, children at risk of poverty, 48%. And although this data is not completely comparable, because at one point we have absolute poverty child rates, absolute poverty rates, and another we have children at risk of poverty, whichever way we look at this data, it is quite depressing and shocking. And it tells you that actually, if you're working in Bosnia and Herzegovina as a teacher, every third child that you're working with is probably living in poverty, or every fifth one if you're living in Albania and working in schools there. So this data is something that we started with when we started our project. We also know that some countries, regardless of high poverty rates, have better results in the well-being of the children. However, this is not really the case in our region. So I'll take you a little bit through the research. And what does research tell us? Research studies on the impact of poverty on child development and well-being are usually conducted by comparing the development of children that are growing up in poverty with their peers that come from middle-class families or even from wealthier ones. Other methods that are used are those that through the research on economic mobility, in which case they would look at a time in the consequences of sudden income increase on child development. What is interesting is that before, poverty was perceived as the static phenomenon, But recent poverty studies recognize the dynamic nature of poverty and take into account two very important factors, and that's its timing and duration of poverty. Duration is looked at persistent poverty or transient poverty. So persistent is long-lasting time of poverty. And then it looks at timing, when in the child development it is more adverse. Concerning about duration of poverty, it was shown that persistent poverty has more the detrimental effect on early childhood development for young children. While when it comes to the question of timing, studies are not really consistent. Some studies show that the detrimental effect of poverty are more visible during the first few years of life, while others see this middle childhood as particularly sensitive period. But whatever study we look at, there is always strong correlation between poverty and all aspects of child development, cognitive and socioemotional development, school achievement, resilience, and coping mechanisms. There are others as well. The differences are especially seen when it comes to cognitive and language development. And just a few concrete data: children living in poverty up to age of 4 achieve a significantly lower performance on all performance tests than children who did not live in poverty at that time. The effects of poverty is more important to cognitive development than other factors, such as parents' education or parents' cognitive abilities. Poor and low SES children perform significantly worse than their middle-class peers on many indicators of academic tests, such as test scores, grades retention, course failures, high school graduation rate, high school dropout rate, and completed years of schooling. And then another quite catastrophic result is that children living in poverty have 12 times lower chances of finishing secondary school than other children. I will show two graphs here that are from some recent research. I hope they will be visible to you. I know they're not the best, and I'm not the best in making graphs. This graph is showing us percentage of 15-year-old students who have achieved minimum proficiency in reading, divided by socioeconomic status and then language spoken at home. This is PISA results from 2018. And you will see that for our countries, for example, and I hope you can see my mouse and that it will help you read the data. For example, North Macedonia. So the empty circle is the poorest students. The full circle is the richest. The line is the average. And you see that the difference between achievement in reading, proficiency in reading, between those who are poor and those who are rich are huge in North Macedonia. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, quite big. In Albania, same thing. If we move a little bit down here to Serbia, also not good. And then we also have Turkey, which is here. So regardless of how well they do on average, and they are actually aligned according to the average results, in all our countries which were in this study, so Kosovo is the one that is missing, the difference is quite big between the rich and the poor. And then there is also the linguistic minority, which is something that I think we can look at, especially when we look at Roma populations in our countries, where this is an extra factor that affects their achievement. This is PISA result. One important thing that you have to know about PISA results when you're discussing it, that although this is quite a good sample of 15-year-olds, actually a lot of children are excluded from the sample. It could be up to 20 to 25% of children who are not in the sample. And actually, most commonly, these are rural students. So students living outside of big cities. And this means that actually this data might be even worse if it was really fully sampled and it had those 20 or 25 students included. So yeah, quite bad on achievement and reading proficiency. And then if we look at data for upper secondary school completion rate by wealth, again, looking at the richest 20% and poorest 20%. And here, the data is not from the same years. It goes from 2011 to 2018, and the source is World Inequality Database on Education. So even if the data is a little bit older, like for Serbia here from 2014, almost 100% of students from 20% of welfare complete, but only about 80% of students from poor backgrounds. We also have North Macedonia here. The situation is even worse here, under 40%. This is data from 2011, and I'm sure it has improved in the meantime, but probably not fully. We also have Turkey here, quite drastic. Less than 20% of those who are coming from the poor backgrounds complete secondary school. So both of these graphs, I just wanted to help you to illustrate the gravity of the situation in our countries. Moving to effects of poverty on socio-emotional development. And here we have, again, quite drastic results. Studies show that children growing up poor are more likely than middle-class children to display social emotional problems in two broad areas, so externalizing and internalizing. Externalizing interpersonal problems such as aggression, destructiveness, behavior, and hyperactivity, while for internalizing interpersonal problems such as anxiety, depression, fearfulness, lower levels of social competence in their relationship with peers and adults. And what is interesting that for the persistent poverty, this internalizing interpersonal problems is more common. While for externalizing interpersonal problems, it's more about transient poverty. So this one that is not permanent. And here, what we have to really know that what children are going through in these circumstances. For the internalization, it's explained by the effect of chronic adversity, basically on children's brain, on their neurobiological stress system, and the fact that they live in poverty are more likely to exhibit markers of chronic stress. But we also have said, and I think that is important to note, I think it was our colleagues from I'm not sure from which organization, who said not only poor children have problems, and this is true. We have stress and anxiety and aggression also with children who are not living in these circumstances. But this is just telling you that it's more likely that if you do live in such circumstances, you might have these problems. While the externalization, as I said, is an outcome of transient poverty. And this is attributed to their constant changes in consistency and unpredictability into the lives of children. So they're kind of living in a chaos and a chaotic situation, and then they're behaving in this way. So what do we know about features of physical environment and psychosocial experience of children in poverty? We know that they usually have lack of developmentally stimulating and supportive resources. And this is not only about lack of material resources, such as book, toys, or didactic materials. And I guess in this age, it would be also the digital resources that they need even to attend school these days, but also psychosocial resources, such as either parent time or shared family activities. And then a large number of discrete and chronic stressors that affect children's being both, they affect them both directly and indirectly. So we have parent stress as one of the factors, chaotic environment inside and outside their homes, less positive interactions with adults, and less support of peers. Also, they're very often victims of bullying, and it could go, as we said, both ways. They could be bullied themselves, but also, of course, with aggression and things that come from other ways of internalizing or externalizing interpersonal problems, they could be bullies themselves. So this is a physical environment in which they live. What we also know, and this is one more interesting graph that I wanted to show you, which talks about disadvantaged students and how they feel at school. And they feel that they don't belong at school, or more they don't belong more in the schools than advantaged students. And here again, so disadvantaged students, empty circle, advantaged students, full circle. And again, if we go to some of our data, Albania being all the way on the right, it's interesting that Albania actually students feel that they belong to school quite strongly, but the difference between the advantaged and disadvantaged are still quite strong. We also have, now I forgot where they are in my graph, but here Bosnia and Herzegovina, feeling of belonging, quite a big difference. I think we have one more country from our group here. But this also tells you that worldwide, this is the problem. This is also PISA study. That actually, if you look, almost nowhere do we have little difference or no difference between disadvantage and advantage when it comes to feeling of belonging to school. And this factor of feeling of belonging to school includes quite a few. It's an indicator, it's an index that has things like, I feel lonely at school. I have no friends. I feel like I belong. And it's quite sad when you think that this is the feeling generally of students in schools, but then even more so the disadvantage for those who come from low SES backgrounds. What we know, though, and this is, I guess, positive, is that education has a crucial role in breaking the circle of poverty. And if you look at the poverty cycle, how it looks now, families in poverty, the child grows up in poverty, it is disadvantaged in education, struggles to get a job, fails to escape the poverty cycle, and it returns over and over again. So actually where the change is, as some of you put in your slogan, is here. We really need to provide these students with adequate education and with a good schooling experience in order for them to break the cycle. And all data shows this. So education has a positive effect on all aspects of child development and well-being. Yet, most of the students living in poverty also face poor quality of teaching and learning, often are in overcrowded classes. This is global data, so it might not be true for your country, but it's still in general true. Lack learning materials, this is definitely true in all countries. Have insufficient instructional time, so not enough support in learning. Often face gender biases, which is a different issue, but still connected to poverty, and are taught by inadequately trained teachers. So when you look at this, instead of actually increasing all of this for the children from low SES backgrounds and poverty in order for them to break the poverty cycle, we are actually not providing this. And in a way, we are stopping this breaking of the poverty. And we do have things that we could do as a system. We are, of course, if we were a system, if we were a ministry, we would be responsible for it. But in this, while this is not happening as much as we would hope, there is a role for all of us in trying to break this poverty cycle. I will continue a little bit about factors and myths that affect teaching and learning. And I'm sure most of you have heard or know about these things from before, but it's not bad to mention it again. One of the biggest influences on children and their learning success is, of course, teachers. And we know, and step by step, teachers matter and teachers are important. We all know that they're more important than we sometimes think. And what is crucial here is their attitude as well. So unfortunately, we have a situation that research shows us that teachers tend to perceive poor students less positively than their other peers as non-mature, low self-regulation skills, dependent on others. And then they have lower achievement expectations from poor children, and that is based not on their actually abilities, but on things that they hear or see, such as speech patterns and clothes. Therefore, they pay less positive attention to them, provide less learning opportunities for them, and do not reinforce their good performances. And of course, we're not talking about all teachers, because of course, there are teachers indeed who are the heroes of their students and who make that one adult difference to every child that every child needs in order to actually be able to succeed. And this is also data that I always find quite amazing. That each child needs only one adult. Of course, it's better to have a village. That's the best. But if you don't have a village, even one adult who gives you positive attention, provides you with learning opportunities, and reinforces good performance can make a huge difference in the lives of especially vulnerable students. So where does this come from? This thing. It comes from deficit theory, which was a dominant way of explaining why students from disadvantaged groups show high failure rate in school. So it's believed that some groups or some students are more prone, or just are more, it is a given that they will be more successful than others. And teachers are inclined to think about those students in terms of their weaknesses rather than about their strengths, and then to have these lower expectations of their ability to achieve. We know from all research that teacher expectations, just like parent expectations, are crucial for students' achievement. And what the result of this deficit theory is this self-fulfilling prophecy, which we have also heard so many times before. But just to go through it one more time. So it's also this Pygmalion effect, as they called it, or self-fulfilling prophecy. An individual or an entire group is labeled. And if we're discussing in our countries, all of our countries, I would say, probably the most labeled students in our classrooms are Roma. So we have an individual or entire group labeled. Teachers begin to behave in accordance with the label that was attributed to them, explicitly or implicitly. Explicitly, for example, by not encouraging them, by giving them lower grades for the same things and all of these things, but also implicitly. And this is the danger that we really have and we have to think about, is when a teacher thinks they're doing something good, they're trying to help by giving less of a homework, passing them with a grade, although they were not. So sometimes this high expectation or willingness to help can have actually an adverse effect. And we really have to be very aware of this implicit way of behaving towards the label that we have attributed. And then once the group or individual kind of starts living with this label, they start behaving in accordance with the label. So if they're labeled as less competent or as less motivated or as lazy or as so on and so on, they start doing exactly that. And in the end, probably drop out of school or are low achievers. And in the end, they justify the label they have been given and the circle continues. So deficit theory is a big issue. And when we talk to teachers, often we hear that they treat all students equally. Yeah? You hear that from parents as well. But actually, when you think about your own life experiences, even if you're not a teacher and even if you're not a parent, it's not about treating equally. It's actually giving what they need. And some might need more support, some might need more autonomy. And this is an important thing to realize, that equal treatment does not provide for equity. And moving on to the culture of poverty myth, which I've also given you here a little cartoon that I think is a great explanation of how we assign this. So it's a joke, of course, but it's not I guess not too funny, but it's a good explanation. So the lady says, the state auditor's remarks have me totally confused. Are we poor because we don't want to work? Or is it just a lifestyle choice on our part? Or is it simply because we have poor money management skills? So this is what we assign. And this is actually a very good illustration of culture of poverty myth. So this is the idea that poor people share more or less same and predictable beliefs, values, behaviors, which are responsible for their underprivileged status. They're lazy, they do not value education, they're not motivated to learn, they don't know how to manage money, it's their life choice to be poor, etc., etc. The myth of the culture of poverty distracts us from actually the most dangerous culture that does exist, the culture of classism, and its diverse attention away from what people in poverty do have in common. And this is inequitable access to basic human rights. So it's about the system. It's actually about oppression. The mechanism associated with the culture of poverty myth that serves to justify prejudice towards poor people and maintains this system of oppression is quite well known as blaming the victim. According to the blame the victim mechanism, the roots of social problems are placed in the characteristics of a group suffering from these problems, instead of placing them within the system that is oppressive in various ways and that creates unequal opportunities and possibilities for different groups. And how does that work? I gave you an example. The problem and the population stricken by it are defined. So for example, Roma children perform poorly in school. They're highly likely to drop out. The value systems, culture, and typical behaviors of the population with the problem and the one without it are compared, usually by stereotyping. For example, Roma value freedom. They're unaccustomed to work. They do not value education. Then the cause of the problem is placed within the difference between the population with the problem and the one without it. For example, Roma children have the problem because their parents do not value education, while actually neglecting the fact that parents might have had a horrible experience in school themselves, that nobody's communicating with the parents, that parents might be employed, they might not have enough resources to support their children with school books, supplies, and for other reasons. And then the implementation of actions is aimed at changing the problematic population rather than changing the system, which is not good for them.